Retakes, outtakes, and double takes. It's axiomatic that TV is imitative and cyclical. Some of the new season's product, just being aired as I write, particularly the sitcoms, is flimsy, undernourished, and old-fashioned, like holdovers from the 50s. One show, American Dreams, is built around Dick Clark's American Bandstand, circa 1962, featuring old black and white film clips and impersonations. The networks have apparently decided, in those troubled and troubling times, their 18 to 49-year-old target audience actually wants chewing gum for the mind and escapism. For the most part, they're leaving inventive comedy and drama to their cable competition while they concentrate on junk reality programming, and their audiences continue to decline. Early in my career, we produced 39 original hours each season, and 13 were rerun during the summer. More recently, most series receive short orders for perhaps 6 episodes, with a handful of renewals if they're lucky. Shows used to be released off-network, syndicated to groups of independent stations, only after their network lives had expired. For some time now, many series run on the network and in syndication simultaneously. Of course, that practice uses up available time slots and discourages new programming. Almost all of my credits are for 1-hour programs. The Virginian was 90 minutes, and most dealt with police characters, like George Kennedy, one of 10 or 12 Academy Award-winning actors with whom I've worked, as Bumper Morgan in Joe Wambaugh's The Blue Knight, or detectives like Robert Ironside. I have one motion picture credit, Sergeant Riker, a TV movie starring Lee Marvin, which I was asked to re-edit for theatrical release. Bud Kulick, the original director, paid me a great compliment after he screened the new version when he took the trouble to call to say thanks for not ruining his film. Except for one unsold pilot, Lily, with Shelley Duvall, it may have been a 60-minute show, I produced only 2 half-hour series. The New Lassie, for Al Burton, and a sitcom, Mr. Merlin. Nimble and clever, Al delighted in giving lotto tickets as Christmas gifts, with the understanding that winners would split with him. You may know that screen credits are an important commodity in the entertainment industry and are vigorously negotiated, particularly by actors, directors, writers, and producers, or, in all likelihood, their agents. A produced by credit once actually meant something, before the proliferation of artificial producing credits, a singularly disreputable practice. Some producing credits are accorded writers to sweeten their deals, or, to be fair, because they do perform producing as well as writing services, as I did. Unfortunately, many are undeserved payoffs, and the end credits, which acknowledge the contributions of technical personnel, usually go by so quickly that they can't be read. Adding insult to injury, they're currently squeezed into half the available space to make room for promotional material, reducing the names to an indecipherable jumble. Mr. Merlin was created by Larry Tucker and Larry Rosen, the Larrys, a likable and dynamic duo. The wonderful actor Bernard Hughes starred as a later-day Merlin, who lived in San Francisco and had a teenage assistant in training. A great kid, but a fuck-up. See Mickey Mouse as the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Unlike most sitcoms, which are taped live, on a unit set with multiple cameras, Merlin was shot like a 1-hour film. 1 or 2 cameras on interior and exterior locations, partly because of special effects. That was 1982. Personal computers were on the way, but hadn't arrived yet. Most of the effects were done with the camera and by special effects men. As had been the case earlier with Ghost Story / Circle of Fear, the effects were not very spectacular by today's high-tech standards, and some were difficult to achieve. But the effects men were innovative and inventive, and they worked their asses off. I think with the sophisticated computer technology and the same Bernard Hughes, Mr. Merlin would be a success today. At least it would be an original. I recall the two Larrys with much affection. Rosen was dark, intense, and handsome. Tucker was extremely overweight and conducted most of his business always in a jumpsuit from a giant recliner in the corner of his office. Like Jerry Eisenberg and Jerry Abrams, the partners I worked with on the 70s medical show Julie Farr, MD, and the TV movie The Gift, the two guys were very bright, compatible, and extremely funny. Susan Sullivan and Mitch Ryan, who co-starred in Julie Farr, were later reunited as Greg's stuffy parents, about 25 years later, on Dharma and Greg. John Avnet and Steve Tisch were another team I knew briefly on the ambitious Call to Glory. Steve went on to produce movies he co-produced, Forrest Gump. John continues to develop classy material and has become a feature film and TV director. All in all, it's 50-odd years, except for technological and stylistic differences. TV has progressed little. Filmed in black and white, Ben Casey was as good in its day as any contemporary medical show. Route 66, Peter Gunn, and The Richard Boone Show, an anthology with a repertory company of excellent actors, were fresher. The Defenders and Naked City, as relevant and dramatic. George Burns broke the fourth wall and spoke to the audience on The Burns and Allen Show more than 40 years before Gary Shandling. Arrest and Trial was a well-made forerunner of Law and Order in all its incarnations, and at least 30 years earlier, it was notable for having 2 stars with identical billing requirements. A conundrum. I think it was Universal VP Jennings Lang who thought of alternating their credit positions on the main titles each week, as well as the prominence of their names on the screen. Jennings was also instrumental in developing one of the most original and non-formula TV concepts, the Bold Ones Wheel, which rotated different hour-long series once a month. The Bold Ones featured doctors, lawyers, and a senator, a mayor, and a chief of police, allowing for spin-offs and replacements as the ratings dictated. I can't imagine a more touching emotional scene in one of today's dramas than one I remember from an episode of St. Elsewhere. A young doctor's wife dies, and her heart is transplanted into a terminally ill patient. The operation is a success, and afterwards, the doctor listens with his stethoscope to his wife's heart, still beating in the sleeping patient's chest. That memorable scene might well have been Bruce Paltrow's doing. He was the show's executive producer. 3 forms which have not been successfully resurrected are variety, westerns, and anthologies. Although some long-form westerns, Lonesome Dove, have been well-produced and well-received. I was fortunate to work in all 3 forms, if you count the Jerry Lewis Labor Day telethons as variety shows. 2. Clu Gallagher, who played Sheriff Emmett Riker on The Virginian, and was featured in The Last Picture Show, used to call me down to the set when he had a script problem. He'd take me aside with professional courtesy, away from the crew, open the script to the scene in question, point to the offending lines and say in his soft, slow drawl, "Now these lines here, these are good lines. They're perfect lines, and a lot of good actors could say these lines, but they just don't fit in my mouth." Clu taught me another valuable lesson about script writing. On one of my excursions to the set, he motioned to me, and we found our usual corner. "Now look," he said, "I want you to know I read the whole script, not just my part, stage directions and all. And I do that because I figure the writer had something special in mind when he wrote it. And I try to, capture what he had in mind as much as I can, because I know what he had in mind was important. But tomorrow, when you folks go to the dailies, you may miss something, and I want to tell you that I tried, but..." "Clu," I said, "cut to the chase." Then he opened the script to a certain page and pointed to a certain stage direction. This is exactly what it said. "The sheriff reddens visibly." "Now I'm going to try it," Clu said with a sly grin. "But you may not see it tomorrow, and I want you to know at least I tried." I got the message, reached for a pen, and crossed out the words. "Thanks," Clue said, starting back to the set. "I think I can handle the rest of it." Clue distrusted horses, and whenever a script called for the sheriff to ride, we'd cut to something else while Clue mounted from a stepladder. Then his double would wheel away from camera and gallop off briskly. Everyone who saw the finished film thought Clue rode like the wind. The broadcast standards, continuity, acceptance, program practices, departments at the networks are the censors. During most of my time producing, from the early 60s to the early 90s, their primary concerns were about nudity, profanity, and open-mouth kisses. I vividly recall negotiating how many hells and damns I'd be allowed in a script. More recently, Steve Bochco's prime-time network shows have pushed the envelope considerably, with much stronger language and partial nudity. I wonder how those network censors would cope with today's TV language and the occasional Full Monty on HBO's Oz. I received one historic memo that had to do with a scene in a Virginian episode. The stage direction read, "The horses led off stage, and we hear a shot." The memo from the network censor read, "Be sure there is an SPCA representative on set when you shoot the horse." That one I framed. I still have it. Another classic was prompted by Joe Wambaugh's sly insertion of a line in one of the Blue Knight scripts. The character George Kennedy played was Bumper Morgan, a uniformed beat cop. The network's exact reaction to Joe's provocative line was, "Please find another expression to replace Bumper's 'till your dicks turn up.'" The quotes, the caps, and the underline are all theirs, worth no less than 8 copies. The Knight Rider series enjoyed some popularity and still has a cult following. It starred David Hasselhoff, later of Baywatch fame, as investigator Michael Knight, and a state-of-the-art computerized car with a voice named KIT, which stood for something I've long since forgotten. The accomplished actor Bill Daniels provided the voice of the car. I rarely saw him. He recorded his lines for each episode on a looping stage, always with the utmost professionalism, despite the far-fetched concept. At least it was then. Which in our saner moments we thought was juvenile and ludicrous. One day, Bill called me out of a meeting. That was unusual. When I picked up my secretary's phone, he asked me to look at a particular page in the script, and about the middle, where Michael and Kit were conferring. "Okay, I've got it," I said. "Right there." Bill said, "About 3/8 of a page down. I don't think the car would say that." I thought he was kidding, and I laughed politely. But as I looked more closely, I saw that he was not only serious, but absolutely right. The lines were totally out of character for the car. Later, I left the show to produce the Welcome to Paradise pilot for CBS in New Zealand. It was probably just as well, since I apparently was unable to compose an appropriate dialogue for a thinking car. Kit was a hyped-up version of a Pontiac Trans Am, which was frequently smashed up in production. Fortunately, we had a number of doubles. With the use of miniatures, camera tricks, and special effects, the car performed some spectacular stunts. Dick Lyndon was the Universal VP in charge of current programming, and he was heavily invested professionally and creatively in Knight Rider. He loved the concept and monitored the scripts closely to ensure an adequate number of stunts. He always insisted we film at least one pedestrian or passerby reacting to the car's extraordinary athleticism. Universal Studios was purchased by MCA when it was considered to be an industry white elephant. People in the know laughed when the agency plunked down a few $1,000,000 for the 500 acres of prime real estate, and was subsequently forced by the government to disband, due to conflicts of interest. They didn't laugh for long. Universal's TV operation flourished. Before the studio purchase, it had been Review Productions, and it was the first studio to open its facilities to tourists. Until the backlot was decimated to make way for the Universal tours, the industry mentality was that movie-making should be kept secret. But Universal management was way ahead of that. When they first developed the tours, before the thrill rides and city walk, they incorporated the lot's western streets, European streets, city streets, ranches, apartment house facades, and the exterior studio locations of all their shows, creating an amazing, practical, and profitable synergy. I was surprised when, for the fun of it, I took a tram ride up to the tour center and saw people lined up to sit in a version of KIT and talk with the car. Obviously, there was someone hidden nearby with a microphone, and it certainly wasn't Bill Daniels. But nevertheless, they all waited patiently for their turn in the driver's seat. For some time, Universal has been designated an actual city, with its own mayor and police department. As a result, and by design, the name Universal City is widespread, including freeway signs, tourist brochures, and maps. Great advertising and PR, virtually free. Jennings Lang once walked me over to the facilities department, and in the basement, he showed off a scale model of the Universal City of the future. No longer a studio, but a small metropolis with office buildings and hotels on the Lancashire Boulevard side, and apartments and condos on the far side, facing Barham Boulevard. It was an extremely ambitious and impressive display. By now the concept has been partially realized. The Sheraton Universal Hotel, built in the late 60s, became the first in what is now a clutter of commercial buildings, replacing what was once a cluster of bungalows, with rabbits playing in the hedges. I used the hotel in a film when it was still under construction, after much haranguing, and later it became the Craig Institute, the interior of the hospital and the bold ones, doctors. The side of the hotel, overlooking the Hollywood freeway, used to be a hillside where sheep grazed, a reciprocal arrangement with the shepherd that kept the hill well shorn, and where part of Kirk Douglas's epic Spartacus, I'm Spartacus, no, I'm Spartacus, was filmed. The individual bungalows house celebrities like Gregory Peck, Alfred Hitchcock, and Cary Grant, and Roy Huggins and I shared one for a while. I'm afraid there aren't many of us left who still remember the sheep and the rabbits. 3. Paramount made a mercifully short-lived series based on the successful motion picture Foul Play. The movie starred Chevy Chase and Goldie Hawn, and the series Deborah Raffin and Barry Bostwick. Later, the mayor in Spin City. When I was hired, production on the series was already underway, and there were problems. I was developing live-action TV movies and pilots for Hanna-Barbera, and I was missing the day-to-day series routine. Having surveyed my share of production misfortunes, I'd gained a modest reputation for troubleshooting. One of the first series I wrote for was called The Troubleshooters, with decathlon champion Bob Mathis, who'd been a classmate at Stanford, and Keenan Wynn, who later appeared with Craig T. Nelson in Call to Glory, which I briefly produced. I worked closely with Joe Berbera, whose professional life was dedicated to animation. I don't think his heart was ever really in live action, but his business advisor suggested he get his feet wet, and we, had some success. In order to attract established skeptical writers to our fledgling operation, I persuaded Joe to provide development money rather than asking them to speculate. The HB business people were horrified. Meetings with Joe were problematic, interrupted frequently by the appearance of hand puppet versions of new animated characters peeking around the open door and trying out voices on Joe. Clearly, he found them more engaging than my pitches for new product. Everyone, I mean everyone, told me to stay away from Foul Play. Too many headaches, creative differences, logistic problems, too many committees. I met with my agents, the two stars, separately, the head of the TV operation, the network brass, executive producer-creator Hal Sidowitz. They all said things like, "Believe me, you don't need this. What do you need this for?" And the more they said, "Who needs it?" the more I had to do it. I should have known I was in trouble when I ran the 2-hour pilot, which I liked, and Hal told me everyone else hated it and everything was being changed, including the color and style of Deborah Raffin's hair, which I thought looked just right. There was more. Both stars, Deborah and Barry, had presumably been given identical contracts with identical script approval. Now that's trouble. And my impression was that they weren't particularly compatible, although the whole creative enterprise was vested in their chemistry and their relationship on screen. About the logistic problems. Someone had come up with the bright idea of leaving a donut hole in each episode of a scene or two missing, stockpiling the shows, and shooting the missing scenes all at once on location in San Francisco, regardless of scheduling, while the unfinished episodes sat on a shelf. Because of lead time and scheduling limitations, everyone should have recognized what a truly dumb idea that was. Episodes simply could not be completed in time to make the air dates. For me, one of the most sensitive areas of foul play concerned the adult twins, little people, who played featured roles. In real life, they were successful entrepreneurs and appeared in a number of TV infomercials promoting their real estate investment system. They were handsome, bright, and articulate. My problem was that I could never call the guys by name because I could never tell them apart. Deborah Raffin was thoughtful and lovely. Barry Bostwick was intelligent and challenging. Among other things, for no apparent reason, he decided his character should play the violin, a la Sherlock Holmes. He also mentioned that he spent time relaxing, a la Michael Jackson, in some kind of hyperbaric chamber, and he recommended it highly. I politely declined, pleading claustrophobia. I regret that I had used the pseudonym on foul play, Roy Irving's. The show was a beast that would not be tamed, but I should have faced the music openly, like everyone else. Afterwards, Deborah and her producer husband, Michael Viner, called me on it, and they were right to do so. Actually, there are ways to handle the challenge of non-location location filming. For example, with Longstreet, which had New Orleans background, but filmed on the Paramount lot. We took a second unit crew to the Big Easy for a couple of days and shot extensive library footage. The three principal actors, James Francius, Marilyn Mason, and Peter Mark Richmond, came with us, and we filmed in various wardrobes, day and night, walking, talking, driving. Marilyn drove for the blind Longstreet, and entering and exiting different colorful establishments, notably Longstreet's French Quarter home and office on Charles Street. We did the talking shots from appropriate angles and just far enough away from the camera so that we could lay in wild dialogue over selected footage and use it in any number of ways throughout the season. Our very talented director, Bill Campbell, built a beautiful unit set on one of the sound stages, matching the interior-exterior to the location we'd found. We could drive someone up to Longstreet's house in New Orleans using our stock footage, and since it was large enough, overlap the drive-up on the Paramount stage with the same car. It was very effective, and many people believe the entire series was shot on location. In the 60s, at Warner Brothers, where TV show budgets were marginal and sacrosanct, we were more significantly challenged. But for Hawaiian Eye, the studio sprang for a unit set featuring a replica of the entrance and lobby for the Hawaiian Village Hotel. We used it regularly, intercut with stock shots, but the actors never got to Hawaii. Neither did my wife and I. But my brother Roy and sister-in-law Eileen were treated royally when they went there on their honeymoon after I contacted the management. Warner Brothers must have made some deal with that hotel. The usual shooting schedule for the hour-long black and white shows like 77 Sunset Strip or Hawaiian Eye was 5 or 6 days and allowed for no location filming. Each year, we produced 39 original programs, and an entire season was covered by 2 days of second unit work. On the first day, we filmed run-throughs and drive-ups with the stars Ephraim Zimbalist and Roger Smith. Ed Kooky Burns, Louis Quinn, and Jacqueline Beer also appeared in the show, but we couldn't afford to take them away from the studio. On the second day, we'd filmed establishing shots of houses, office buildings, apartments, some with Stu Bailey's and Jeff Spencer's cars parked in front. We also hired 2 pretty extras, a blonde and a brunette, and photographed them from a distance in various settings: restaurant patios, balconies, street corners, parking lots, and later we cast actresses who resembled them for given episodes, matching their hair color and wardrobe. Acting ability counted, of course, but matching the extras could be equally important. Warner Brothers had a kind of stock company in those days. The actors rotated among the series, one week guesting on a western, the next on a detective show. A few became quite successful and well known. Others failed to graduate. Roger Smith later married Anne Margaret, a lasting romance. And there was a rumor, probably unfounded, that a very cute actress, Nancy Valentine, had her navel removed to accommodate a Saudi Arabian prince with a peculiar aberration. 77 Sunset Strip lasted for 7 or 8 years. I guess Warner Brothers got its money's worth from all that stock footage. The Warner Brothers shows of the early 60s were exclusive to ABC, apparently the result of personal as well as business relationships. The budget for the detective shows was in the mid-60s, that is, the mid-$60,000. I tried to persuade the production people to let me amortize costs from show to show over the course of a season, but they were adamant about keeping each episode on budget. The least expensive episode I produced at Warner's cost $62,000 from beginning to end. The most expensive was $72,000, and I crammed a small traveling circus into it. I almost got fired for that. Memos quickly bombarded everyone in the TV department. Hereafter, there will be no scripts approved which include circuses. It was 1962. Only 5 years later, in 1967, my hand shook as I signed off on a $900,000 budget for one of the early movies for television at Universal. Today, each of the 6 stars of Friends earns $1 million per episode. 4. I spent a great deal of time on the phone with the inimitable Shelley Winters, trying to persuade her to commit to a pilot called Big Rose, about a female private detective. Her co-star was to be Barry Primus, an excellent young actor, and that helped. But Shelley was reluctant to do a weekly series. I guess we hit it off on the phone, because she arrived in due course from New York with flags flying. I visited her in her dressing room on the Fox lot one day during pre-production, and indeed all her flags were flying. As she reclined on a couch in a black negligee with delicately exposed cleavage, when she saw that my wife Deborah was with me, she gracefully covered up and welcomed us both warmly. Ours was the first film company to shoot at the just-completed Century Plaza Hotel. We made arrangements to film in the lobby area for one night only, when no one was around, with the stipulation that we finish by 7 a.m. We shot everything we could without Shelley, who was scheduled but indisposed in her room upstairs. Time was running out, and 7 a.m. fast approaching. The director, Paul Cranzi, and I found a way to eliminate Shelley from the hotel scenes. At the very last moment, Shelley appeared, in wardrobe and fully made up, looking marvelous and sweeping onto set like Gloria Swanson in Sunset Boulevard. The crew was tired and impatient, but they favored her with scattered applause. Unfortunately, by then there was nothing for us to shoot with her. We improvised a little scene and spent what time was left filming her from every possible angle on one of the lobby's house phones. Never was one-sided phone call so generously covered. Shelley proved to be a delight. She even took to the cute little dog Carl Miller trained overnight to sneeze and alert whenever Barry, her assistant in the show, tried to sneak in late to work. Carl trained several white German shepherds to portray the guide dog Pax on the Longstreet series. He also took care of our own dogs, a gentle mixed shepherd, Heidi, and a hyper Irish setter, Bridget, while we were on brief vacation. When we came to pick them up, Carl trotted them out, beautifully groomed, and told us he'd been able to put some manners in them, but advised that if we wanted to keep the affectionate Heidi from licking people, we'd have to shoot her. The last time I saw Shelley Winters, she was on the looping stage recording new lines with great care and attention to detail. I think she was relieved when the pilot aired and the network passed on the series. There were 2 actors I worked with whenever I had a suitable role. One was the consummate professional Victor Jory, who called once a year to ask, "When will my script be ready?" Long before we met, I wrote scripts for his police detective series, Manhunt. I remember he played Detective Finucane, and I loved the name. I used it in dialogue as often as I could. The other regular was Carl Swenson, a lovely character actor I used to listen to on radio when I was a kid, home from school with asthma. Whenever he was cast, Victor would stop by my office wearing the character clothes he'd picked out from the wardrobe department days before his scheduled appearance, so he could put them under his mattress and sleep on them for the proper lived-in look. He also generously offered to perform with or without his teeth, demonstrating the effect by delicately placing his dentures on the edge of my desk while reciting lines he'd already memorized. I knew all of Carl Swenson's radio roles. Lord Henry Brinthrope on Argyll Sunday, and the title roles in Minster Keene, Tracer of Lost Persons, and Lorenzo Jones among them. And he was delighted to encounter such a fan. Radio meant as much to me as an asthmatic kid as it did later to Woody Allen when he reminisced in radio days. I still vividly recall the programs, and even some of their scheduling. In the late afternoon and evening, Fibber McGee and Molly, Terry, and the Pirates, The Great Gindersleeve starring Harold Peary, Sergeant Preston of the Yukon and his dog King, Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, I Love a Mystery, created by Charlton E. Morse, who also created One Man's Family. Eva Marie Saint was one of the stars. Suspense, Inner Sanctum, Lux Presents Hollywood, Lights Out, The Shadow. Much later, Jimmy Sangster and I tried to develop it at Screen Gems as a TV series. Don Winslow of the Navy, The Green Hornet, Van Williams from Surfside 6 starred in the TV version with Bruce Lee. And on Saturday mornings, Let's Pretend, Grand Central Station, Henry Aldrich. Ezra Stone played Henry, and I worked with him much later when he became a TV director. Corliss Archer. On Sunday night, we listened to Eddie Cantor, Kate Smith, Jack Benny, Fred Allen, and Edgar Bergen, and Charlie McCarthy. And I knew all the women of the soaps. Stella Dadless, young Wider Brown, Helen Trent, Ma Perkins, Argyll Sunday. They all enriched my early stay-at-home years. 5. James Francis and Marilyn Mason starred in the Longstreet series, and while the show had some difficulty competing opposite Ironside, the actors and crew were a delight. During production, Marilyn went on a diet, and her weight loss became noticeable in person and on film. I complained that when we intercut first and second unit footage, shots of Marilyn wouldn't match, especially in the bosom department. She registered my complaints with good humor. As usual, we put together a Christmas reel highlighting outtakes, flubs, and miscues. Outstanding that year was a shot of Marilyn, back to camera, looking over her shoulder provocatively. Then she turned, flashing an enormous pair of unflattered breasts. "You want tits, Rogosin?" she announced. "Here's tits." She was terrific, Marilyn. In one scene, she and her boss, Longstreet, discovered a body hanging in a barn. Marilyn looked directly into the camera and deadpanned, "Boy, is he hung." Longstreet represented another arc in my life, not only because I became friendly later with Renee and Harry Longstreet, and Harry's father, author-artist Stephen. Remember, he insisted his name had been stolen. But also because Sterling Silliphant was the creator-executive producer. Years earlier, when I was a newcomer, and Sterling was producing Route 66, I attended a writing workshop he conducted, sometimes at his Columbia Pictures office, sometimes at his home in Glendale. A big pink stucco house that at the time represented something to aspire to. I liked Sterling very much. And about 10 years after Longstreet was a memory, I produced the CBS pilot that he'd created, Welcome to Paradise, in New Zealand. It was Route 66 on the water, designed to feature Sterling's yacht and 3 good-looking young performers on various South Pacific locations. The idea was to find an identical yacht and leapfrog them from place to place, riding a day or so ahead of the itinerary. As most industry people knew, Route 66 was a logistics nightmare. The cast and crew traveled continuously, and Sterling, in his TV prime, nearly killed himself keeping up with locations, weather conditions, temperaments, and illnesses, delivering script pages before PCs a day at a time. It's a tribute to his ability and endurance that he and the show survived so credibly. And that was just in the continental U.S. Imagine attempting a similar feat with 2 sailing ships and their crews, camera and production personnel, actors, and truly distant, unpredictable locations. The project was mind-blowing and totally impractical, but CBS had a deal with Sterling, so we worked long hours on the pilot and had a great time in New Zealand. Bruce Lee had given Sterling some instruction in Jeet Kune Do, which James Coburn also studied. When Longstreet sold as a series, Sterling cast Bruce in a recurring role. His first episode was called The Way of the Intercepting Fist, in which he schooled Jim Francis as the blind Michael Longstreet in the somewhat esoteric martial art. It was one of our better shows, and memorable for several encounters I had with the fun-loving Bruce. Actually, encounters is a misnomer. They were ambushes. I'm not sure if it was before or after the Pink Panther movies with Peter Sellers. It was 1970 or 71, in which similar occurrences took place. But Bruce used to hide behind my open office door, and when I came in, he'd grab me from behind in a grip of steel, pinning my arms and immobilizing me while he demanded that I beef up his part in next week's episode. He was about 5'6", but he was very powerful. With each ambush, his role in Longstreet got bigger and better. A very good journeyman director, my friend, Don McDougall, directed that first Longstreet episode, and he worked with me on several series through the years. He was amiable and competent, but he didn't particularly like or trust actors. I think they intimidated him. His background was technical rather than theatrical. Whenever they'd ask to discuss dialogue or motivation, he'd call me down to the set and say, "I told you not to hire this guy. He's got questions. You talk to him." Don frequently accused me of too many rewrites, and I have to admit I was thorough to the edge of anal compulsion. He called me up once in the middle of the night when we were filming a Virginian episode and said that as usual the rewrites had been delivered when he was already asleep. He'd gotten up to study them, knowing how picky I was. He was extremely pissed off. Each set of revisions was Xeroxed in a different color. My writer-producer friends, Jimmy Sangster and Ernie Frankel, called me Rainbow Rogosin, and I'd insisted a system of putting asterisks in the margins to identify changes. Don said he'd located the fucking changes and they were tolerable. But there was one he couldn't find. Since he'd been up for hours looking for it, he said, he'd figured he'd get me up to tell him where and what the elusive fucking change was. I rolled out of bed, found my copy of the script, turned to the page in question, and realized I had no idea what I had changed at the place he had indicated. Together on the phone, we read the page aloud, much to Deborah and Mrs. McDougall's annoyance. Finally, holding the page up to the light, I saw it, a mimeographed whiteout mark, in one line of dialogue. I'd changed a period to a semicolon. Don hung up on me, and when I visited the set the next morning, he pretended to ignore me. But he cut the camera, sat down in his director's chair, and refused to continue filming until I left. For a short time, we waited each other out as I chatted with the cameraman and the actors. Then, seeing I was hopelessly overmatched, I slipped out with as much dignity as I could muster. The crew thought it was very funny, and I let the heavy stage door close behind me. I heard my friend Don say pointedly, "Now that the suit's gone, we can get back to work." It was the ultimate insult, and ironic, since I'd long ago given up suits for jeans and sweatshirts. One of Don's accomplishments was his ability to direct the small practical train in and out of the Virginian's Medicine Bow station on the western street of the Universal backlot using a variety of camera angles. That came in very handy one day when one of the stars, Jim Drury, was, for a change, AWOL. We got Doug McClure out of bed to replace Jim in the episode in his sidekick role of Trampus. While we waited, Don, not wanting to just sit around when there was nothing else scheduled to shoot except the station, kept filming the train pulling in and out. Just as Doug arrived and we prepared to shoot the long-delayed scene, Jim showed up, having overslept after a big night out. The crew had been annoyed with Jim, then worried about him. Now everyone was relieved to see him alive. Concealed under his habitual broad-brimmed Stetson, our short, fiery cameraman, Bud Thackeray, had been especially concerned. Seeing Jim safe, he started toward him, fists clenched, threatening to belt him once now that he knew he was okay. The crew restrained him. It was just as well. I don't think Bud's fist could have reached Jim's chin anyway. We resumed shooting, and Doug McClure went back to bed. I was friendly with Drury and McClure. Doug came to our house to swim with his daughter Tanny, and a couple of times Jim and I rode his beautiful Appaloosa horses together. Filming the train in and out of the station was a thankless job. There were only so many camera angles available. But some guys, like Don McDougall, just had it, and some guys didn't. A director named Billy Whitney, had it. He was admired for, among other things, the way he filmed horses and horsemen in numbers galloping into a scene or up onto a hitching rail in clouds of sweat and dust. Few could match his technique, and his ride-ups were singularly exciting. 6. The TV movie I produced in 1967, The Sunshine Patriot, was loosely based on a Virginian project I could never get approved. The writer, Gustav Field, and I updated and transformed it into a sort of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, and we wound up with a pretty good script. Cliff Robertson had just received an Oscar for his role in the motion picture Charlie, and he was hot, but apparently not hot enough to generate many offers, because after a good deal of negotiating and cajoling, he finally agreed to star in our movie. When he read the script, the wonderful Joe Sargent said he'd direct. I was particularly pleased because Joe turned down a major theatrical film for our TV project. Luther Adler, Stella's brother, Lila Scala, Cliff's wife Dina Merrill, and Donald Sutherland were the co-stars. I'd gone to a great deal of trouble to get Luther, sending a script to him in Cudston, Pennsylvania, via messenger and a private plane. The plane landed in a cow pasture near Luther's house late at night, and the pilot delivered the script by hand. I didn't know him at all, but the next morning, Luther called me, furious, demanding to know why I'd awakened him for such a lousy TV role. A day or so later, he strode into my office, unannounced, fire in his eye. "Are you Rogosin?" he demanded, still unresolved. "The son of a bitch who wakes people up in the middle of the night?" Then he reached into his pocket, took out a wad of bills, and threw it on my desk. He'd read the script for the first time on the plane, and said he hated it. He wanted to buy his way out. I yelled back at Luther, shouting, among other things, about the trouble and expense we'd incurred to deliver the script to him and get him to L.A., and throwing his money back at him. In a moment, we were both laughing, and during the production we became quite fond of each other. Of course, Luther played the part, and he was wonderful. Donald Sutherland had recently arrived from Canada and was a virtual unknown. Unused to his unique speech pattern and an accent he'd assumed for his role, I'd asked him to loop some of his lines in post-production, and he was very annoyed with me. So was Richard Dreyfuss in a similar situation on The Bold Ones, when we needed to reshoot something. I know from their reactions they'd both be stars. Actually, the major stars I worked with were invariably friendly, professional, and cooperative. Cliff Robertson is a fine actor, but at least in the late 60s he was not great with names. He called most people Pappy, as in, "How goes it, Pappy?" He played a dual role and insisted on wearing a beard as one character. I thought it was a crutch, and in those days, when beards were uncommon, a dead giveaway. But he prevailed, in spite of my efforts to get Dina to influence him. He's a collector of antique planes, and the script called for him to climactically steal a plane and fly it out of harm's way. Cliff wanted to use one of his own planes, a vintage de Havilland something or other, an open cockpit biplane. Obviously, he'd be able to write it off. The Universal production executive, Paul Donnelly, who was not known for his even temper, just about split a gut when he learned of Cliff's intention. "No fucking way," he screamed at me, then something unintelligible about insurance. "That's a deal-breaker, over my cold, dead body." I liked Paul, in spite of our run-ins, and I always suspected there was a human being in there somewhere. Actually, he'd simply adopted the typical production exec's volatile temperament, like the infamous Seymour Friedman at the Screen Gems or Jack Fryer at Columbia. Only Charlie Greenlaw, who mentored me at Warner Brothers, was a calm and collected despot. Paul Donnelly and I came to an understanding about Cliff's flying. Paul would tolerate it, so long as it was the last thing on the production schedule, just in case. That way, the completion of the picture would be assured, because we could always use stock footage. Thanks to Joe Sargent and the excellent cast, the entire production went smoothly, beard and all. But on the very last day, Joe walked into my office in the early afternoon, clearly shaken, went to my closet shelf, grabbed a bottle of scotch, and poured himself a stiff one. He poured another before I could ask. "He wrecked the plane," Joe said. I couldn't believe it. Joe found a seat. First of all, Cliff was okay, he told me, but the plane was a mess. Coming in for a landing, a wingtip had caught a phone line, and the plane had turned over. Cliff landed it upside down and burning, hanging out of the cockpit while his wife, Dina, looked on in horror. "Don't worry, we kept rolling," Joe said. "You'll see the whole thing in dailies tomorrow." And I did, along with Paul Donnelly, who never let me forget it. The studio had a deal with John Gavin and wanted him to star in a new series, Destry, based remotely on the motion pictures. But they hadn't seen him and couldn't imagine him as a cowboy. Jennings Lang, the TV vice president, told me to get John to test. I had a hunch it might be me being tested. John was an established actor, and there was no way he'd agree to it. "Call it a wardrobe test," Jennings said. So I got John into suitable Western clothes, borrowed a skeleton crew and an empty set, and filmed as many angles as we could get, with and without hat, with and without gun belt. I knew I'd thought of everything, and was very pleased with myself. Jennings was somewhat less than pleased when he ripped into me the next day after seeing the test. The set I'd managed to borrow was a section of a submarine interior, and it was Jennings' considered opinion that no one could tell shit from Shinola about John's Western credibility in a modern submarine set. I had to admit he had a point. Still concentrating on wardrobe, I persuaded John to let us film him again on the backlot, in as close as we could get to a period Western setting. He was wonderfully cooperative, although I thought that by then he must have been on to us. We filmed him on horseback, mounting and dismounting, riding to and from camera, and without hat, and without gun belt. We got enough coverage to make a full-length movie. At that juncture, I felt I had little to lose, and I got with one of my editors, and we did a job on that test. Among other things, we added stock footage of poses, chases, bathroom brawls, cattle stampedes, train robberies, and shootouts. Obviously, John wasn't in any of it, but we intercut it with various angles of his wardrobe test, and it definitely spiced things up. Oh, yes, we also added sound effects and music. Destry didn't last for long, but John Gavin did, and he became ambassador to Mexico. I wound up with the only edited, scored, and dubbed wardrobe test in motion picture history. 7. One of my last network producing credits was on the new Lassie series, 1989-90. It was probably the first and only time the star was smarter, better groomed, better behaved, and smelled better than me. It was also the only time a production manager, John Ward, tried to scare the shit out of me, barreling down a narrow path on one of the Universal backlot hills in a golf cart at top speed. We could have both been killed. I don't know what John's problem was. Sibling rivalry? But there was no love lost between us, and we soon parted company. I never heard of him after that. The Weatherwax family are the Lassie professionals. On one movie, when no one else could, Rudd, the grandfather, was able to teach a collie to come out of the water without shaking off, and the rest is canine history. Lassies are bred for the white patch on their foreheads, which is not common to that breed and not suitable for show. And different lassies are proficient at different stunts. Crawling, climbing, barking on cue, opening things. When the Weatherwaxes get lucky, they're able to train several lassies at once, each with the white patch and all males. The story goes that a principal lassie once developed mange so badly that his genitalia started to show. The secret was nearly out. But if lassie is your meal ticket, you improvise. The Weatherwaxes had a pubic wig made, and no one caught on. When I asked one of the lassie pros, who trains other movie dogs as well, what breed he'd recommend, he'd said something like, "Check out the animal shelters and get a mutt. Whatever you do, don't get a collie. They're stupid." He must have been having a bad day. So as far as I know, only one person in the entertainment industry has a camera shot named for him. Abby Singer. Abby, when I worked with him at Universal, was already a seasoned production manager who had no business being one because, unlike the prototype, he was a kind and gentle soul. When I was producing, the usual procedure was for the production department to be in touch with the set periodically during the day to check on the progress of the filming. It was the duty of the assistant director or the production manager, whichever was available and couldn't avoid it, to call in the department with a progress report. Towards the end of the day, the status became increasingly important, since it established how far the company would be behind when a wrap was called. When Abby was subjected to one of those horrendous, intimidating 6:45 p.m. phone calls marking the imminent close of a scheduled 12-hour production day, of which everyone on the set, particularly the long-suffering director, was keenly aware, his invariable answer to the crucial question was the penultimate, "This and one more." He meant there was one shot in progress, then one additional shot to complete the day's work. Of course, it was rarely just one more, but Abby somehow got away with it. Because he was well loved, even while he was being severely berated. The director always had one more, and a couple of others, but nevertheless, the next to final shot of the day came to be widely known as the Abby Singer. I'm pleased to further memorialize him with this instructive anecdote. I worked with another production manager, I think it was Benny Bishop, who invariably snorted an emphatic no whenever I asked for something. Sometimes I conceded the incidental skirmish, saving my strength for the inevitable battles ahead. On one occasion, I ventured something challenging like, "Why can't we do that?" And Benny said, referring to union rates, "Because if we do that, it's double gold." "What's double gold?" I demanded. Benny hesitated. "I don't know, but it's terrible."